Hey guys, tonight we step into the shadowy, stone-walled world of medieval Europe, where doorways barely reach your shoulders, and every entrance feels like a test of humility, or a recipe for a bruised forehead. Picture yourself in a damp, torch-lit village, the air thick with wood smoke and the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer. You're trudging toward a squat wooden door, its iron hinges rusted, its top edge so low you'd swear it was built for hobbits. One wrong step, and you're nursing a lump the size of a goose egg. Spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this without ducking. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your city and local time. I'm curious where you're drifting off from tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing before one of these tiny doorways, wondering why anyone would design a building that forces you to stoop like you're sneaking into a secret club. The answer isn't just one thing, it's a tangle of practicality, culture, and survival. Let's start with the basics. Medieval doorways were low, often between 4 and 5 feet high, because buildings were designed with purpose over comfort. Homes, taverns, and even castles prioritized function, and tall, grand entrances were a luxury few could afford. The mainstream fact here is that most medieval structures were built with limited resources. Timber, stone, and manpower weren't infinite. Smaller doorways meant less material, less labor, and faster construction. A 6-foot door might look impressive, but why waste the wood when you could feed your family for a month instead? Now, let's lean into a quirkier angle. Some folks in the Middle Ages believed low doorways kept evil spirits at bay. The logic: malevolent forces, being a bit pompous, wouldn't bother stooping to enter a humble home. It's a stretch, but you can imagine a superstitious villager nodding sagely, convinced their stubby doorway was a ghost-proof barrier. Historians still argue whether this was a widespread belief or just a quirky regional tale, but it adds a layer of charm to those cramped entrances. You duck through the doorway now, your head grazing the lintel, and step into a dimly lit room. The floor is packed earth, maybe strewn with rushes to soak up the mud you're tracking in. The ceiling's low too, because medieval builders weren't exactly chasing open-plan aesthetics. Homes were small, often 1 or 2 rooms, and keeping them warm was a nightmare. A low doorway helped trap heat, especially in winter when the wind howled like a pack of wolves. You can almost feel the chill seeping through the walls, the fire in the hearth barely keeping it at bay. Smaller openings meant less draft, and in a world without central heating, that was a big deal. But let's not romanticize it too much. These doorways were a pain. Imagine you're a medieval peasant, hauling a sack of grain or a bundle of firewood. You're not just ducking, you're twisting, cursing under your breath as your shoulder clips the frame. And if you're tall for the time, say a lofty 5'8", every entrance is a personal insult. Here's a little joke for you. Why did the medieval peasant always look grumpy? Because his house kept giving him a headache, literally. It's not just the physical strain, though. These doorways shaped how you moved through the world, forcing a kind of mindfulness. You couldn't rush in or out without paying attention, or you'd regret it. The practical side ties back to the materials. Timber was the backbone of most buildings, but good quality wood was scarce in many regions. You'd need a sturdy beam for the lintel, and long ones were pricier. Stone was even trickier. Cutting and hauling it took serious effort. So, builders kept things compact. A 4-foot doorway used less oak or limestone than a 6-foot one, and in a society where survival often trumped style, that was a no-brainer. Plus, smaller doorways were easier to reinforce. A heavy oak door on a low frame could withstand a battering ram better than a tall, flimsy one. You're probably wondering if this was universal. Spoiler: it wasn't. Castles and churches sometimes had grander entrances, especially for ceremonial spaces. But for the average person, peasants, merchants, even minor nobles, low doorways were the norm. They weren't just practical, they were a reflection of a world where humility was a virtue, at least in theory. You duck to enter, you bow to the space, and maybe, just maybe, that was the point. Or maybe it was just cheaper. Either way, you're starting to see the logic. Let's toss in another quirky tidbit. Some doorways were so low they doubled as a kind of medieval captcha. If you could navigate the entrance without smacking your head, you were probably a local who knew the drill. Strangers, good luck. It's like the Middle Ages had a built-in, "I'm not a robot" test, except it was, "I'm not a clumsy outsider." Historians still argue whether this was intentional or just a happy accident, but it's fun to imagine a smirking carpenter designing a doorway to trip up the tax collector. As you settle into this medieval mindset, you realize these doorways weren't just architectural quirks, they were a window into a world of scarcity, superstition, and survival. You're not just ducking to avoid a bruise, you're stepping into a life where every choice, from the height of a door to the thickness of a wall, was a calculated move. The next time you pass through a low doorway, you'll feel it, the weight of centuries, the echo of people who stooped just like you, navigating a world that was never quite built for comfort. You're still in that medieval village, the scent of damp straw and smoky hearths clinging to your cloak as you approach another low doorway, this one set into the thick stone walls of a small castle. You duck, naturally, because by now you've learned the hard way, your forehead still smarting from that last lintel you underestimated. Tonight, you're diving into how these tiny entrances weren't just about saving wood or warding off ghosts, they were strategic, built to keep invaders at bay. In a world where a neighbor might turn into a raider by sundown, low doorways were like the medieval equivalent of a "proceed at your own risk" sign. Picture yourself as a would-be attacker, chainmail clinking, sword in hand, charging toward a castle's entrance. You're expecting a grand gate, but instead, you're faced with a doorway so low it's practically mocking you. You can't just storm in, you've got to crouch, slow down, and expose your neck to anyone waiting inside. That's the mainstream fact here. Low doorways were a deliberate defense tactic in fortifications. Castles, keeps, and even some manor houses used them to create choke points, forcing attackers to funnel through one at a time, vulnerable and off balance. It's like the medieval architects were saying, "Come on in, but you're gonna regret it." You pause outside this doorway, peering into the gloom. Inside, you can just make out the flicker of torchlight and the glint of a guard's spear. If you're foolish enough to charge, you'll have to bend nearly double, your shield awkward, your sword useless in such a tight space. The defenders, meanwhile, are ready to skewer you like a kebab. A single well-placed archer or a guy with a pointy stick could ruin your day. This design wasn't an accident. Castles like Bodiam or Stokesay, with their squat entrances, were built to maximize the defender's advantage. One historical record from a 14th century siege describes attackers getting stuck in a low doorway, picked off one by one like they were auditioning for the world's worst conga line. Now, let's lean into something quirkier. Some castles had murder holes right above these low doorways, small openings where defenders could pour boiling water, hot sand, or worse onto your head as you ducked. Ever wonder where the phrase, "pouring it on," came from? Okay, maybe not, but imagine the panic of crouching through a doorway while dodging a shower of scalding oil. It's like a medieval version of running through a sprinkler, except you're not laughing. Historians still argue whether these murder holes were used as often as the stories claim. Some say they were more for show, a psychological deterrent, while others insist the charred bones found at some castle sites tell a different tale. You step back and take in the castle's walls, pockmarked from years of weathering and the occasional catapult stone. These low doorways weren't just about defense in the heat of battle, they also slowed down sneak attacks. A thief or assassin couldn't just slip in unnoticed, they'd have to contort themselves, making noise and wasting time. And if you're thinking, why not just make the walls thicker? Well, you're not wrong, but resources were tight. Stone was heavy, quarrying was slow, and skilled masons weren't exactly on speed dial. A low doorway was a cheap, effective way to add security without rebuilding the whole castle. Let's lighten the mood with a joke. Why did the knight hate low doorways? Because his ego was too big to stoop. Seriously, though, You can imagine some puffed-up noble grumbling as his helmet scraped the lintel, his dignity taking a bigger hit than his head. These doorways didn't care about your status, king or peasant, you bowed to the architecture. That's a humbling thought, isn't it? In a world obsessed with hierarchy, the doorway was the great equalizer. Back to the strategy. Low doorways also worked because medieval warfare wasn't just about swords and arrows. Sieges were long, drawn-out affairs, and castles were designed to outlast the enemy. A smaller entrance meant fewer points to guard, so a handful of defenders could hold off a larger force. You're picturing it now. 10 attackers trying to squeeze through while 2 guys with spears make them rethink their life choices. It's not just about brute force, it's about control. The doorway dictated the pace, the posture, and the outcome. You might be wondering about the practical side for the castle's residents. Constantly ducking couldn't have been fun, right? Well, you're not wrong. Even the lord of the castle had to stoop, though some had private entrances with slightly higher doorways, perks of being the boss. But for the average soldier or servant, it was just part of the gig. You got used to it, like you get used to a lumpy mattress or a diet of barley gruel. And if you didn't, well, there's a reason medieval skulls in museums often have suspicious dents. Here's another joke for you. What do you call a clumsy medieval guard? A walking concussion. The quirky bit comes back into play when you consider how these doorways shaped castle culture. Some stories suggest low entrances were a way to enforce respect. Guests had to literally bow to enter the lord's domain. It's a bit of a stretch, but you can imagine a crafty baron designing his castle to make everyone, friend or foe, show a little deference. Historians still argue whether this was a real custom or just a romanticized idea from later chroniclers, but it's a fun thought. You're ducking now, not just to avoid a bruise, but maybe to pay homage to the guy whose castle you're visiting. As you stand there, feeling the weight of the stone above you, you realize these doorways were more than just obstacles. They were a statement, a line in the sand. They said, "This place is ours, and you're not getting in without a fight." And yet, they were also a daily reminder of the world you lived in, one where safety came at the cost of comfort, where every entrance was a calculated risk. You're starting to see the medieval mind at work, practical, paranoid, and just a little bit cheeky. You glance back at that low doorway, its edges worn smooth by centuries of hands and shoulders brushing past. It's not just a piece of architecture, it's a survival tool, a piece of the puzzle that kept castles standing through wars and raids. Next time you're in a medieval fortress, you'll feel it, the ghost of that strategy, the echo of a world where even a doorway could be a weapon. You're back in the medieval world, your boots sinking slightly into the muddy street of a bustling village, the air sharp with a tang of livestock and fresh-baked bread. You're eyeing another low doorway, this one in a wattle and daub cottage, its frame barely clearing your chest. You've already got the ducking reflex down, but every time you stoop, you can't help but wonder, what was it like to live with these head-knocking entrances every single day? Tonight, you're stepping into the awkward, sometimes comical reality of navigating these cramped doorways as a medieval villager, where every entrance was a lesson in patience and every exit a potential pratfall. Imagine you're a peasant, your day packed with chores, milking cows, hauling water, or dodging the local lord's tax collector. Every time you head out or come home, you've got to crouch through a doorway that feels like it was sized for a particularly ambitious badger. The mainstream fact here is that low doorways were a constant in medieval domestic life, especially in rural homes. These weren't grand castles but simple dwellings, often built by the families who lived in them. The small size wasn't just about saving materials, it was about making do with what you had, rough timber, uneven stones, and a whole lot of hope that the roof wouldn't collapse. A low doorway was practical, but it came with a daily dose of inconvenience. You duck into the cottage now, your eyes adjusting to the dim interior, lit only by a smoky fire and a sliver of light through a narrow window. The ceiling's low, the walls are rough, and the doorway you just squeezed through feels like a portal to a world designed for discomfort. If you're carrying anything, a basket of turnips, a bundle of kindling, you're doing a clumsy dance, twisting sideways to avoid clipping your elbows or banging your head. It's like trying to thread a needle while riding a donkey. Here's a little joke for you. Why did the medieval housewife always win at limbo? Because she practiced every time she went to the market. Let's toss in a quirky tidbit. Some medieval homes had doorways so low that crawling was sometimes easier than stooping, especially for kids or the elderly. There's even a tale from a 13th century chronicle about a monk who got stuck in a doorway while delivering alms, his robes tangled, his dignity in tatters. It's probably exaggerated, but you can picture the scene. Poor guy flailing like a turtle on its back, the villagers trying not to laugh. Historians still argue whether these stories were meant to entertain or to highlight the real struggles of daily life, but they paint a vivid picture of a world where even entering your own home was an adventure. Now, think about the physical toll. You're not just ducking once a day, you're doing it dozens of times, coming in from the fields, stepping out to check on the chickens, or popping over to gossip with a neighbor. If you're tall for the era, maybe pushing 5'10", you're living in a constant state of mild exasperation. Your back aches, your neck stiff, and you've got a permanent scowl from all the times you misjudged the lintel. And it's not just you, everyone's dealing with it. Kids probably loved it, scampering through like it was a game, but for adults, it was a grind. You can almost hear the collective sigh of a village full of people rubbing their foreheads. The doorway's size also shaped how you lived inside. These homes were small, often one room where you cooked, ate, slept, and argued with your cousin about who ate the last bit of cheese. A low doorway meant less heat escaped, which was critical when your only warmth came from a fire that smoked more than it burned. But it also meant you were always mindful of your movements. You couldn't just barge in after a long day, you had to slow down, duck, and ease through. It's almost meditative, in a "why does my house hate me" kind of way. Let's add another joke to keep things light. What did the medieval villager say to his low doorway? "You're keeping me grounded, literally." But seriously, these doorways forced a kind of awareness. You had to pay attention, or you'd pay with a bruise. It's a stark contrast to today, where we breeze through automatic sliding doors without a second thought. Back then, every entrance was a negotiation, a moment where the house reminded you who was boss. On the quirkier side, some villages had a strange custom where newlyweds would carry each other through the doorway on their wedding night. Good luck with that when the frame's barely 4 feet high. It's hard to be romantic when you're both crawling like you're escaping a sinking ship. Historians still argue whether this was a real tradition or just a bit of folklore, but it's easy to imagine the laughter and chaos of a bride and groom trying to make it work without knocking each other out. You're starting to feel the rhythm of this life, the way these doorways shaped not just your movements but your mindset. They were a daily reminder of your place in the world, humble, practical, and just a little absurd. You might have grumbled, but you adapted. You learned to duck without thinking, to laugh off the occasional bump, to live in a world where even the simplest act, like walking through a door, came with a challenge. And maybe, in a weird way, that made you tougher. You weren't just navigating doorways. You were navigating a life where nothing came easy. As you step back outside, careful to duck again, you glance at the cottage's rough walls, the doorway's weathered frame. It's not much, but it's home. And in that moment, you realize these low doorways weren't just obstacles. They were part of the fabric of medieval life, woven into every day, every bruise, every quiet moment of resilience. You're trudging through a medieval hamlet now, your cloak snagging on a thorn bush as you eye another stubbornly low doorway, this one carved into a squat stone house that looks like it's been here since dragons were a legitimate concern. The air's damp, carrying the faint whiff of wet wool and the distant lowing of cattle. You've got the ducking routine down, but every time you bend, you're wondering why these doorways seem to defy basic human proportions. Tonight, you're diving into the nuts and bolts of why medieval builders made them so low, peeling back the curtain on the architectural constraints that shaped these head-banging entrances. Picture yourself as a medieval builder, your hands calloused, your tools a mix of iron chisels and sheer determination. You're not working with a Home Depot catalog or a CAD program, just a pile of uneven timber, some quarried stone if you're lucky, and a deadline to get this house up before winter turns your village into a popsicle. The mainstream fact here is that low doorways were a direct result of limited building materials and technology. Timber for lintels, the horizontal beams over doorways, was often in short supply, especially in deforested regions like parts of England or France by the 13th century. A shorter lintel meant less wood, and when good oak was worth its weight in ale, you didn't waste it on a doorway you could have just ducked through. You're standing at the construction site now, watching a carpenter wrestle with a gnarled beam, trying to make it fit across the doorway. The wood's not straight, because medieval forests weren't exactly quality-controlled lumberyards. Long, sturdy beams were rare and expensive, reserved for roofs or the lord's fancy hall. For a peasant's cottage, you used what you could scavenge, short, knotty timber or even salvaged scraps. A 4-foot doorway was easier to frame than a 6-foot one, and it meant you could slap together a house without begging the local baron for a loan. Stone was no better. If you're building with it, you're hauling it from a quarry miles away, probably on a cart pulled by an ox that's as fed up as you are. Smaller doorways meant fewer stones to cut and carry, which was a win when your mason's toolkit was basically a hammer and a prayer. Let's toss in a quirky tidbit. Some builders used corbelled doorways, where stones were stacked in a way that jutted inward, narrowing the top. It looked cool, like a mini arch, but it also meant you had to duck even more to avoid clipping your head on the overhang. There's a story from a Welsh village where a local drunk swore the corbelled doorway moved to mess with him. Spoiler, it was just the ale talking. Historians still argue whether corbelling was purely practical or a stylistic flex, but it's a reminder that even medieval builders had a sense of flair, even if it came at the cost of a few concussions. You're probably picturing the chaos of construction now. No blueprints, no levelers, just a bunch of villagers eyeballing measurements and hoping for the best. The tools were basic: saws that dulled faster than your patience, adzes that could take your thumb off if you weren't careful. Building a doorway wasn't just about aesthetics, it was about what you could manage with the resources at hand. In colder regions, like Scotland, you kept doorways small to minimize heat loss, because a roaring fire was your only defense against frostbite. In warmer areas, like southern France, you still went low to save on materials, but also because stone buildings were heavy, and tall doorways risked structural collapse if your masonry skills weren't top tier. Here's a little joke to keep the vibe light. Why did the medieval builder make such low doorways? Because he was too short to think taller. Okay, maybe not, but you get the idea. Practicality ruled. These builders weren't trying to torture you, they were working with what they had. And what they had was often a patchwork of scavenged wood, local stone, and a whole lot of grit. If you wanted a grand entrance, you'd better be a king with a treasury to burn. The constraints weren't just about materials, though. Labor was another bottleneck. Building a house took a village, literally. You'd have neighbors pitching in, maybe a traveling mason if you were fancy, but skilled workers were scarce. A low doorway was quicker to construct, which meant you could focus on the important stuff, like making sure the walls didn't fall on your head. Plus, medieval engineering wasn't exactly precise. Without modern measurements, doorways were often built to fit the materials you had, not some idealized height. If your lintel was 4 feet long, guess what? Your doorway was 4 feet high. Let's add another quirky angle. Some doorways were so low because builders reused old materials from Roman ruins or earlier structures. In parts of Italy or Spain, you'd find doorways cobbled together from mismatched stones, sized for a long-gone era when people were, frankly, just as annoyed about ducking. It's like medieval recycling, except instead of saving the planet, you were saving your budget. Historians still argue whether this reuse was common or just a regional quirk, but it's a fun glimpse into a world where nothing went to waste, not even a cracked Roman column. You're starting to feel the weight of these constraints, aren't you? Every low doorway was a compromise, a balance between what you wanted and what you could actually pull off. You duck through one now, your knees creaking, and you can almost hear the builder's ghost chuckling. Sorry, mate, this was the best we could do. And yet, these doorways stood the test of time, holding up homes and lives through centuries of storms, wars, and bad hair days. Here's one more joke for you. What do you call a medieval doorway that's too low? A humility check. Because every time you ducked, you were reminded to stay grounded. As you step into the house, the fire crackling in the corner, you realize these doorways weren't just about cutting corners. They were about making a life possible in a world where every resource was precious, every decision a gamble. You're wandering through a medieval town now, the cobblestones uneven under your feet, the air buzzing with the chatter of merchants and the creak of cartwheels. You pause before another low doorway, this one in a timber-framed house, its lintels so close to the ground you're half tempted to crawl. You've ducked through enough of these by now to know the drill, but tonight, you're not just dodging a bruise, you're peeling back the layers of meaning behind these pint-sized entrances. Why were medieval doorways so low? Sure, they saved wood and kept out drafts, but there's more to it. You're about to step into a world where doorways weren't just practical, they were loaded with spiritual and social symbolism, shaping how people saw themselves and their place in the universe. You stoop through the doorway, the rough wood brushing your shoulders, and enter a dimly lit room where a family huddles around a flickering hearth. The mainstream fact here is that medieval architecture often carried symbolic weight, especially in homes and churches. Low doorways weren't always just about saving materials. They were designed to evoke humility, a core virtue in a deeply religious society. Every time you ducked to enter a space, you were physically bowing, not just to the house but to the values it represented. Think of it as a daily reminder to check your ego, like a medieval post-it note saying, "Stay humble, pal." Picture yourself in this world, where life revolves around faith and community. The church loomed large, its teachings woven into every aspect of daily life, from the prayers you muttered at dawn to the tithes you grudgingly paid. A low doorway wasn't just a quirk of construction, it was a nod to the idea that entering a home, or even a tavern, was a sacred act. You were crossing a threshold, a boundary between the chaotic outside world and the sanctity of the interior. Ducking was a gesture of respect, a way to honor the space and its inhabitants. It's almost poetic, until you smack your head for the third time that day. Let's toss in a quirky tidbit. Some medieval folklore held that low doorways forced you to bow to the household spirits or saints believed to protect the home. In parts of rural England, people whispered that a tall, proud stride through a doorway might offend these unseen guardians, inviting bad luck, like a spilled ale or a sick cow. It's a stretch, but you can imagine a superstitious villager ducking extra low, just to be safe. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were widespread or just local quirks, but they add a layer of magic to those stubby frames. You're settling into the room now, the warmth of the fire easing the chill in your bones. The low doorway behind you feels like a gatekeeper, a reminder that this space is special. And it wasn't just about spirituality. Social hierarchy played a role too. In a society obsessed with status, doorways could reinforce who was in charge. In wealthier homes, the lord or lady might have a slightly higher entrance to their private chambers, while servants and guests had to stoop through lower ones. It's subtle, but it's a power move. You duck, you acknowledge the pecking order, and maybe you grumble about it later over a mug of watery beer. Here's a little joke to keep things light. Why did the medieval noble hate low doorways? Because bowing was beneath him, until the lintel taught him otherwise. Seriously, though, these doorways were a great leveler. King or peasant, you had to stoop, and that shared inconvenience created a kind of unspoken bond. It's like everyone in the Middle Ages was part of a secret club where the initiation was a sore forehead. The symbolism extended beyond homes. In churches, low doorways were even more deliberate. You've probably seen those tiny side entrances in old cathedrals, the ones that make you feel like you're sneaking into Narnia. They were called holy doors in some places, designed to make you bow as you entered God's house. It was a physical act of submission, a way to prepare your soul for worship. Even today, some Orthodox churches keep this tradition, with doorways that force you to lower your head and your pride. It's a beautiful idea, though you can't help but wonder how many monks tripped over their robes in the process. Let's add another quirky angle. In some regions, low doorways were thought to symbolize the narrow path to salvation. The Bible talks about the narrow gate that leads to heaven, and some scholars suggest builders took this literally, crafting doorways that made you squeeze through like you were auditioning for eternal life. It's a bit of a reach, but you can picture a pious carpenter nodding approvingly as he shaved another inch off the lintel. Historians still argue whether this was a conscious design choice or just a convenient excuse for shoddy construction, but it's a fun thought. You're starting to see these doorways differently now, aren't you? They're not just obstacles, they're storytellers, whispering about a world where every act, even stepping into a room, carried meaning. You duck again as you head back outside, the cool night air hitting your face. The doorway's low frame feels like a challenge, a reminder to carry that humility with you. And maybe it's not so bad. In a world full of wars, plagues, and tax collectors, a little forced humility might have kept people grounded, literally and figuratively. Here's one more joke for you. What do you call a medieval doorway that makes you bow? A spiritual speed bump. As you straighten up, rubbing your neck, you realize these doorways were more than just architecture. They were a way of life, a daily ritual that shaped how people moved, thought, and connected. You'll never look at a low doorway the same way again, each one's a tiny sermon, carved in wood and stone. You're trekking across a patchwork of medieval Europe now, the horizon dotted with thatched roofs and crumbling castle towers, the air shifting from the briny tang of a coastal village to the earthy musk of an inland hamlet. Each place has its own flavor, its own way of doing things, and as you approach yet another low doorway, this one in a half-timbered German inn, you're starting to notice they're not all the same. Some are barely 4 feet high, others a smidge taller, some framed in oak, others in rough-hewn stone. Tonight, you're exploring how these doorways varied across regions, each one shaped by local needs, traditions, and the quirks of the land itself. You duck into the inn, the scent of stale ale and roasted mutton wrapping around you like a heavy cloak. The mainstream fact here is that doorway design in medieval Europe wasn't universal. Geography, climate, and culture dictated their size and style. In England, where timber was often scarce by the High Middle Ages, you'd find narrow, low doorways in peasant homes, saving every precious plank for the roof. Head south to Italy, and you might see slightly taller doorways in stone villas, where local quarries made masonry more accessible but still kept things compact to avoid structural risks. These differences weren't random. They were born from the land you stood on and the people who shaped it. Picture yourself in a windswept Scottish village, where the doorways are so low you're practically belly-crawling to get inside. The harsh Highland winters demanded it. Small entrances kept out the howling gales and snow that could bury a house overnight. You're shivering just thinking about it, the fire inside barely enough to thaw your fingers. Now, imagine hopping over to sunny Provence, where the doorways are still low but often wider, built to let in breezes while keeping the scorching heat at bay. The materials changed too. Scots used rough granite or salvaged driftwood, while Provençal builders leaned on limestone, smooth and pale under the Mediterranean sun. Let's toss in a quirky tidbit. In some parts of Scandinavia, doorways were carved with runes or simple symbols, supposedly to ward off trolls or bad luck. You can imagine a Viking-era carpenter etching a jagged line into the lintel, muttering about keeping the forest spirits happy. It's a bit whimsical, but there's evidence of these carvings in old stave churches, where doorways were low enough to make you feel like you were entering a fairy tale. Historians still argue whether these symbols were purely decorative or genuinely believed to have protective power, but they add a touch of magic to the practical. You're moving on now, crossing into a bustling German town where the inn's doorway is reinforced with iron bands, a nod to the region's wealth and its constant threat of bandits. Germany's Black Forest region, rich in timber, allowed for sturdier frames, but the doorways stayed low to conserve heat in those brutal winters. Compare that to Spain, where Moorish influences crept into architecture. There you'd find arched doorways, still low but with a graceful curve, reflecting a blend of Islamic aesthetics and Christian frugality. It's like each region had its own architectural accent, and you're starting to hear the differences. Here's a joke to keep the mood light. Why did the medieval traveler hate regional doorways? Because every new town meant a new bruise. Seriously, though, you're getting a sense of how disorienting it must have been to move from one place to another, each doorway demanding a slightly different duck or dodge. It's like the Middle Ages had a secret choreography, and you had to learn the steps on the fly. The variations weren't just about materials or weather. Culture played a huge role. In Ireland, where storytelling was king, some doorways were built low to encourage guests to linger outside, sharing tales before entering. You can picture a bard leaning against the frame, spinning a yarn about Cú Chulainn while you wait to squeeze inside. In contrast, urban centers like Florence used low doorways in merchant houses to signal modesty. Wealthy traders wanted to look pious, not flashy. It was a social statement, a way to say, I'm rich, but I'm still humble enough to stoop. Let's add another quirky angle. In some Eastern European villages, doorways were sized to fit the family's tallest member, barely. If your dad was 5'4", congrats, your doorway might clear 5 feet, but only just. It's like the house was custom-built to keep everyone on their toes, or rather, their knees. Historians still argue whether this was a practical choice or a weird flex of familial pride, but it's a reminder that even medieval architecture could be personal. You're starting to feel the rhythm of these regional differences, aren't you? Each doorway tells a story, of the land, the people, the weather they fought, and the beliefs they held dear. You duck through another one now, this time in a Dutch fishing village, the frame salty and warped from years of sea spray. It's low, of course, but wider than most, built to let fishermen haul nets inside without snagging. Every region had its own logic, its own way of balancing survival and style. Here's one more joke for you. What do you call a medieval doorway in a windy country? A draft dodger. As you straighten up inside the inn, the chatter of travelers filling the air, you realize these doorways weren't just barriers, they were windows into a continent of diversity. From the stormy coasts of Norway to the sun-baked hills of Tuscany, each low entrance was a snapshot of a people making do, making meaning, and making it through another day. You're standing in a muddy medieval courtyard now, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and the faint clatter of a hammer striking wood in the distance. Before you is a half-built house, its low doorway taking shape as a carpenter wrestles a rough-hewn lintel into place. You've ducked through enough of these entrances to know they're no accident, but tonight, you're diving into the nitty-gritty of how they were made. The tools, the techniques, the sheer stubbornness, it all shaped those head-banging doorways. You're about to get your hands dirty, figuratively at least, as you explore the medieval construction methods that kept doorways so low you'd swear they were trolling you. Picture yourself as that carpenter, your arms aching from swinging an adze, a tool that's half axe, half prayer for precision. The mainstream fact here is that medieval construction relied on rudimentary tools and techniques, which directly influenced doorway size. Saws were coarse, often leaving jagged edges, and chisels were blunt enough to make you cry. Building a doorway wasn't about precision engineering, it was about making do with what you had, usually a pile of uneven timber or stone and a deadline to finish before the rains came. A low doorway was easier to craft because it required shorter, more manageable materials, and it reduced the risk of your whole structure collapsing like a bad joke. You're watching the carpenter now, his breath puffing in the chilly air as he measures the lintel by eye. No tape measures here, just a squint and a gut feeling. Timber was the go-to for most homes, but good wood was hard to come by in many regions. By the 12th century, forests in places like England were thinning out, thanks to shipbuilding and endless demand for firewood. A short lintel, maybe 4 feet long, was easier to source than a 6-foot one, and it was less likely to snap under the weight of a roof. If you were using stone, the challenge was even bigger. Quarrying was backbreaking, and transporting heavy blocks meant coaxing a stubborn ox or two. A smaller doorway meant fewer stones to haul, which was a win when your crew was just you, your cousin, and a guy who owed you a favor. Let's toss in a quirky tidbit. Some builders used a technique called dry stone construction, stacking rocks without mortar in places like Ireland or Scotland. These doorways were often so low you had to crouch like you were hiding from a dragon, because the stones were small and uneven, and piling them higher risked to collapse. There's a story from a Welsh chronicle about a village where a dry stone doorway fell apart during a wedding, dumping rocks on the guests. Talk about a rocky start to married life. Historians still argue whether these tales were exaggerated to scare people into hiring proper masons, but they highlight the gamble of medieval building. You're probably imagining the chaos of a construction site now. No power tools, no safety helmets, just a bunch of folks shouting over the creak of wooden scaffolds. The tools were basic: hand saws that dulled after a few cuts, adzes for shaping beams, and wedges for splitting stone. If you wanted a tall doorway, you needed a long, straight lintel, which was a nightmare to cut and set. A low one, much easier. You could use a shorter beam or even a slab of stone you found by the river. Plus, the lower you went, the less you had to worry about the walls buckling under the weight of the roof, which was a real concern when your engineering knowledge came from trial and error. Here's a joke to keep things light. Why did the medieval carpenter love low doorways? Because they were a cut above the rest. Literally. Okay, maybe not, but you get the idea. These builders weren't trying to make your life harder. They were working within the limits of their tools and materials. And those limits were tight. Even nails were a luxury. Most joints were held together with wooden pegs or sheer hope. A low doorway was a practical choice, a way to get the job done without bankrupting the village. The techniques varied by region, too. In timber-rich areas like Germany's Black Forest, you'd see doorways framed with heavy oak, sturdy but still low to save on wood. In stone-heavy regions like northern Spain, masons used arches to distribute weight, but kept them small to avoid needing a master architect. And in muddy, wattle-and-daub villages in England, doorways were often just woven sticks plastered with clay, so low you wondered if they were built for humans or particularly ambitious rabbits. Every choice was a compromise, shaped by what you could find, carry, or afford. Let's add another quirky angle. Some builders marked their doorways with a carved notch or stone to show who built it, like a medieval signature. In parts of France, you'd find lintels with a crude cross or a mason's initial, a quiet flex of pride in a job well done. Historians still argue whether these marks were for bragging rights or to ward off bad luck, but they're a reminder that even the humblest doorway had a human story behind it. You're starting to feel the weight of this work, aren't you? Every low doorway was a battle against gravity, scarcity, and time. You duck through the half-finished entrance now, the carpenter giving you a nod as you pass. The frame's rough, the lintel slightly crooked, but it's solid. It'll stand for centuries, long after the carpenter's gone. And that's the thing, these doorways weren't just built, they were wrestled into existence, one shaky beam, one chipped stone at a time. Here's one more joke for you. What do you call a medieval doorway with a bad lintel? A headache waiting to happen. As you step inside, the smell of fresh cut wood filling the air, you realize these doorways were more than just entrances. They were proof of ingenuity, of people making homes out of whatever the world gave them, even if it meant a lifetime of ducking. You're trudging through a bustling medieval market now, the air thick with the scent of fresh bread, sour ale, and the occasional whiff of an overworked donkey. You're eyeing a low doorway in a merchant's house, its frame sturdy but barely clearing your chest, and you can't help but wonder why these folks didn't just splurge for a taller entrance. After all, this guy's selling wool by the cartload. Surely he's got the coin. Tonight, you're diving into the economic realities that kept medieval doorways so low, where every inch of wood or stone was a line item in a budget tighter than a miser's fist. Picture yourself as that merchant, your ledger scratched onto a scrap of parchment, every expense a gamble between survival and starvation. The mainstream fact here is that economic constraints were a major driver of low doorways. Building materials, timber, stone, even the iron for hinges, were expensive, and labor wasn't cheap either. A taller doorway meant more resources, more time, and more skilled workers, which most people simply couldn't afford. In a world where a bad harvest could wipe out your savings, a low doorway was a practical choice, like choosing gruel over roast pheasant. It got the job done without breaking the bank. You're standing outside the merchant's house now, watching a carpenter hammer a peg into the doorframe, his brow furrowed as he calculates how to stretch the last of the oak. Timber was a big expense, especially in regions like England or northern France, where forests were shrinking by the 13th century. A 4-foot lintel was cheaper than a 6-foot one, and if you were building a whole house, those savings added up. Stone was even pricier. Quarrying it, hauling it, cutting it into shape took time and muscle. A smaller doorway meant fewer blocks, less transport, and fewer days paying a mason who probably charged extra for his bad attitude. Let's toss in a quirky tidbit. In some towns, doorways were so low because villagers bartered for materials instead of buying them. You might trade a pig for a pile of timber, but your neighbor's not giving you the good stuff. He's handing over the short, warped scraps he couldn't use. There's a story from a Norfolk village where a farmer built his doorway so low because all he could barter was a stack of stunted beams from a shipwreck. It worked, but his guests weren't thrilled. Historians still argue whether bartering led to consistently smaller doorways or if it was just a regional quirk, but it's a reminder that medieval economics was often a game of make-do. You're probably picturing the merchant now, haggling over every nail, every plank. Labor was another cost to juggle. Skilled carpenters and masons weren't exactly lining up for work. Many were snapped up by lords building castles or churches. If you were a peasant or a small-time merchant, you might be stuck with your cousin who's pretty good with a hammer, or a traveling craftsman who'd overcharge you for a week's work. A low doorway was quicker to build, meaning fewer days paying wages or feeding a crew. It was like choosing the budget option at a medieval IKEA, functional, but you're gonna hate assembling it. Here's a joke to keep things light. Why did the medieval merchant love low doorways? Because they kept his costs and his ego in check. Seriously, though, you're starting to see how every decision was about stretching resources. Even wealthier folks, like this merchant, weren't splashing out on grand entrances for their homes. Big doorways were for cathedrals or the king's palace, where showing off was the point. For everyone else, a low doorway was a badge of frugality, proof you weren't wasting money that could buy grain or pay the lord's taxes. The economic angle extended to maintenance, too. A smaller door was easier to repair or replace. If your lintel cracked or your hinges rusted, you weren't stuck sourcing a massive beam or forging new iron. You could patch it up with whatever was lying around. Maybe a chunk of wood from a broken cart or a stone you pried from the riverbank. In a pinch, you might even reuse bits from an older building, like those Roman ruins some folks scavenged. It wasn't pretty, but it kept the rain out and the tax collector guessing. Let's add another quirky angle. In some regions, low doorways were a way to dodge taxes. Local lords sometimes taxed homes based on their size or grandeur, and a tiny entrance made your house look humbler than it was. You can imagine a crafty merchant winking as he ducked through his doorway, knowing he'd shaved a few coins off his bill. Historians still argue whether this was a widespread tactic or just a clever dodge in certain towns, but it's a fun glimpse into the medieval hustle. You're starting to feel the pinch of this economy, aren't you? Every low doorway was a calculation, a balance between what you needed and what you could afford. You duck through the merchant's entrance, the smell of wool and ink hitting you as you step inside. The house is cozy, the fire crackling, but that low frame behind you is a reminder of a world where every choice came with a cost. You're not just ducking to avoid a bruise, you're bowing to a reality where survival meant making every penny count. Here's one more joke for you. What do you call a medieval doorway on a budget? A penny pincher's portal. As you settle into the merchant's home, the clink of coins in the background, you realize these doorways were more than just architecture. They were a testament to ingenuity, to building a life with whatever scraps the world threw your way. You're weaving through a medieval village at dusk now, the sky bruised with purples and oranges, the air sharp with the scent of wood smoke and damp hay. You're approaching another low doorway, this one in a sturdy yeoman's house, its oak frame weathered but solid. By now, you've got the ducking reflex down, but every stoop makes you wonder why these entrances were built like traps for the unwary. Tonight, you're stepping into the role of protector, exploring how low doorways doubled as a line of defense, not just in castles but in everyday homes, shielding families from intruders, weather, and whatever else the world threw at them. Picture yourself as the head of this household, your days spent plowing fields or bartering at the market, your nights haunted by the thought of bandits, wolves, or a storm that could rip your thatch roof to shreds. The mainstream fact here is that low doorways in medieval homes were often designed with safety and security in mind. A smaller entrance was harder for intruders to breach, easier to barricade, and better at keeping out the elements. In a world where locks were flimsy and help was a half-day's ride away, a low doorway was your first, and sometimes only, line of defense. You're standing at the threshold now, your hand brushing the heavy oak door, its surface scarred from years of use. If a thief or raider came knocking, they'd have to crouch to get in, slowing them down and making them vulnerable. You could be waiting inside with a pitchfork, a fire poker, or just a well-aimed pot of stew. The doorway's size forced anyone entering to move deliberately, giving you precious seconds to react. Historical records from 14th-century England mention village homes with doorways so low that even local militias struggled to enter during tax raids, giving residents time to hide their best pigs or that extra sack of grain. Let's toss in a quirky tidbit. In some regions, villagers believed low doorways confused malevolent spirits or witches, who supposedly preferred grand entrances. There's a tale from a Breton hamlet where a farmer swore his tiny doorway kept a shape-shifting hag at bay. She kept banging her head until she gave up and left. It's probably just a fireside story, but you can imagine the comfort it brought, knowing your house was ghost-proofed by architecture. Historians still argue whether these superstitions influenced doorway design or were just a way to justify the inconvenience, but they add a layer of charm to those cramped entrances. You're picturing the practical side now, aren't you? A low doorway wasn't just about stopping bad guys. It was about survival. In stormy regions like Northern Europe, a small entrance kept out howling winds and driving rain. You've seen those winters, the kind that freeze your eyelashes and turn your fingers blue. A tall, wide doorway would let the cold pour in, turning your home into an icebox. A low one, paired with a thick door, trapped heat from the hearth, making the difference between a cozy night and a frostbitten morning. In coastal villages, like those along the North Sea, low doorways also kept out storm surges, saving your floor from becoming a swamp. Here's a joke to keep the vibe light. Why did the medieval homeowner love his low doorway? Because it kept out burglars and bad weather. Talk about a 2-for-1. Seriously, though, you're starting to see how these doorways were like a Swiss Army knife of security. They weren't perfect, but they gave you a fighting chance. And in a world where danger could come from a rival village, a hungry wolf, or a sudden blizzard, that was enough. The security angle wasn't just about physical barriers. A low doorway shaped how you lived, forcing you to be mindful. You couldn't rush in or out without thinking, which meant you were always a little more aware of your surroundings. Was that a shadow moving outside? A creak in the night? You'd notice, because the doorway demanded your attention. It's like the house itself was your lookout, whispering, "Heads up, something's off." And if push came to shove, you could brace a beam across the frame, turning your entrance into a makeshift fortress. Let's add another quirky angle. In some German villages, doorways were built low to make it harder for tax collectors to enter unannounced. You can picture a smug official in his fancy cloak, stooping awkwardly while you accidentally spill ale on his shoes. There's no hard evidence this was a widespread trick, but local records hint at it, and historians still argue whether it was a deliberate jab at authority or just a happy side effect. Either way, it's a fun nod to the medieval art of sticking it to the man. You're starting to feel the weight of this responsibility, aren't you? Every low doorway was a shield, a small act of defiance against a world that didn't play nice. You duck through the entrance now, the warmth of the fire washing over you, the door creaking shut behind. Inside, your family's safe, for tonight, at least. The doorway's low frame feels like a guardian, standing firm against whatever's out there. You're not just ducking to avoid a bruise, you're stepping into a space carved out for protection, a haven built with cunning and care. Here's one more joke for you. What do you call a medieval doorway that stops a thief? A crook catcher. As you settle by the hearth, the flicker of flames dancing on the walls, you realize these doorways were more than just architecture. They were lifelines, keeping the world's dangers at bay while you carved out a life inside. You're weaving through a medieval manor now, the air heavy with the scent of beeswax candles and fresh rushes strewn across the floor. You're eyeing another low doorway, this one leading to the Lord's private chamber, its frame carved with simple knots that hint at status but still force you to duck. You've dodged enough lintels by now to move like a pro, but tonight, you're stepping into the social dance of medieval life, where these low doorways weren't just about saving wood or keeping out bandits. They were shaped by cultural norms, etiquette, and the unspoken rules of who bowed to whom. Picture yourself as a guest in this manor, maybe a merchant or a minor knight, invited to dine with the Lord. You approach the doorway, your head lowering not just to avoid a bruise but to signal respect. The mainstream fact here is that low doorways often reflected medieval social hierarchy and etiquette. In a world obsessed with rank, where a misplaced glance could spark a feud, ducking through a doorway was a physical act of deference, especially in wealthier homes or castles. It was like the architecture itself was reminding you to know your place, whether you were a peasant petitioning the Lord or a noble visiting a rival. You stoop through the doorway now, the cool stone brushing your shoulders as you enter a room lit by flickering torches. The Lord's at the high table, his chair a little grander than the rest, and you can't help but notice how the low entrance made everyone, even his equals, bow just a bit. It's subtle but deliberate. In larger households, doorways to private spaces were often lower than public ones, reinforcing the idea that entering the Lord's domain was a privilege. Historical records from 14th-century France describe manor houses where guests had to duck to enter the Lord's solar, a not-so-subtle reminder of who held the power. Let's toss in a quirky tidbit. In some English villages, it was customary to pause and knock before ducking through a low doorway, even in your own home, as a sign of respect to the household. There's a tale of a forgetful villager who skipped the knock and tripped on the lintel, which the neighbors swore was the house itself punishing his bad manners. Historians still argue whether this was a widespread custom or just a local quirk, but it's a charming glimpse into a world where even doorways had etiquette. You're probably imagining the social chess game now. If you're a servant, you're ducking through the lowest, narrowest doorways, scurrying to deliver firewood or ale. If you're a guest, you're navigating a slightly taller entrance, but still stooping to show you're not above the house's rules. And if you're the Lord, well, you might have a private doorway, just high enough to let you walk upright, barely. It's like the Middle Ages had a built-in humility test, and no one was exempt. Even the king, visiting a noble's castle, would have to bow through certain doors, a rare moment where architecture outranked royalty. Here's a joke to keep things light. Why did the medieval lord hate low doorways? Because his crown kept getting caught on the lintel. Seriously, though, you're starting to see how these doorways were more than just obstacles. They were part of the social fabric. They shaped how people interacted, forcing a moment of pause, a gesture of respect. In a society where status was everything, that small act of ducking could smooth tensions or spark them, depending on how you played it. The cultural norms didn't stop at hierarchy. In some regions, low doorways were tied to hospitality. You ducked to enter a neighbor's home, and that act of lowering yourself was a sign of goodwill, like saying, "I come in peace." In Ireland, where community was tight-knit, low doorways encouraged lingering at the threshold, swapping stories before stepping inside. It's almost cozy, until you remember the bruise on your forehead from misjudging the height. In contrast, urban centers like London used low doorways in merchant houses to signal modesty, a way to avoid looking too flashy in a city full of prying eyes and tax collectors. Let's add another quirky angle. In parts of Scandinavia, low doorways were sometimes linked to wedding traditions, where the groom had to carry the bride through without bumping her head, a test of strength and care. If he failed, the village would tease him for weeks. Historians still argue whether this was a real custom or just a romanticized tale, but you can picture the laughter as a nervous groom ducked extra low, praying not to drop his new wife. It's a reminder that doorways weren't just practical, they were stages for life's big moments. You're starting to feel the weight of these social rules, aren't you? Every low doorway was a cue, a nudge to play your part in the medieval dance of status and respect. You duck through the Lord's chamber now, the air warm with the scent of spiced wine. The doorway's low frame feels like a gatekeeper, reminding you to tread carefully in this world of power and protocol. You're not just avoiding a bump, you're navigating a culture where every gesture mattered. Here's one more joke for you. What do you call a medieval doorway with attitude? A snob stopper. As you settle into the room, the Lord's voice booming over the clatter of plates, you realize these doorways were more than just architecture. They were silent enforcers of etiquette, shaping how people connected, competed, and coexisted in a world where a bow could mean everything. You're trudging along a windswept path now, the bite of a northern gale cutting through your cloak as you approach a low doorway in a stone cottage, its frame barely visible through the swirling mist. The air smells of peat and sea salt, and you can hear the distant crash of waves against a rocky shore. You've ducked through enough of these entrances to know they're not just about saving wood or showing off your bowing skills. Tonight, you're diving into how the climate and environment of medieval Europe shaped these tiny doorways, turning them into shields against the elements in a world where Mother Nature was the real boss. Picture yourself as a villager in this rugged landscape, your life dictated by the whims of weather. Blizzards that bury your home, rains that turn your fields to muck, or heat that bakes your roof until it cracks. The mainstream fact here is that low doorways were often designed to combat environmental challenges, especially in harsh climates. Smaller entrances meant less exposure to wind, rain, snow, or scorching sun, helping homes stay livable when the weather was anything but. In places like Scotland or Norway, where winter storms could rip the door off its hinges, a low doorway was like a bunker hatch, keeping the elements at bay and the warmth inside. You're at the cottage now, your hand brushing the cold stone as you duck through the doorway, the wind howling behind you like it's personally offended. Inside, the air's warmer, the fire crackling in a hearth that's more smoke than flame. A tall doorway would have let that wind pour in, snuffing out your fire and turning your home into an icebox. Historical records from 13th century Iceland describe homes with doorways so low they doubled as windbreaks, saving families from freezing during months-long winters. It wasn't just about comfort, it was about survival. A small entrance could mean the difference between a cozy night and a frostbitten toe. Let's toss in a quirky tidbit. In some coastal villages, doorways were built low to keep out not just wind but seawater from storm surges. There's a story from a Cornish fishing hamlet where a particularly stubborn fisherman claimed his low doorway saved his house during a flood, though his nets still ended up in the neighbor's yard. Historians still argue whether these doorways were deliberately designed for flood protection or just a happy accident, but it's a reminder that medieval builders were always wrestling with the elements, one lintel at a time. You're probably picturing the variety of climates now. In Northern Europe, where winters were brutal, doorways were often paired with thick wooden doors or even leather curtains to seal out drafts. In southern regions, like parts of Spain or Italy, low doorways helped keep homes cool by limiting airflow and blocking the sun's glare. You can imagine a sweltering summer day in Andalusia, the air shimmering with heat, and you're ducking into a stone house where the low doorway creates a pocket of shade, like a natural air conditioner. The materials mattered too. Northern homes used heavy stone or turf to insulate, while southern ones leaned on lighter limestone or adobe, but the low doorway was a constant, a nod to the environment's demands. Here's a joke to keep things light. Why did the medieval villager love his low doorway? Because it kept the weather out and his complaints in. Seriously, though, you're starting to see how these doorways were like armor against the climate. They weren't just about aesthetics or budget. They were about making a home that could stand up to whatever the sky threw at it. And that was no small feat when your weather forecast was, probably awful, good luck. The environmental angle wasn't just about keeping out the cold or heat. In wet regions, like the Low Countries, low doorways helped prevent flooding by raising the threshold above ground level. You'd step up and duck down, a clumsy maneuver that saved your floor from becoming a pond. In mountainous areas, like the Alps, Doorways were built low to protect against avalanches or heavy snow piling up at the entrance. Every region had its own battle with nature, and the doorway was the front line. Let's add another quirky angle. In some highland villages, doorways were angled slightly to deflect wind, a trick borrowed from watching how trees bent in storms. There's a tale from a Scottish glen where a clever builder swore his angled doorway saved his house from a gale that flattened half the village. Historians still argue whether this was a common technique or just one guy's stroke of genius, but it's a fun nod to the ingenuity of people who had to outsmart the weather with nothing but stones and hope. You're starting to feel the chill of that wind now, aren't you? Every low doorway was a compromise with the environment, a way to carve out a livable space in a world that didn't care if you were comfortable. You duck through the cottage's entrance again, the fire's warmth wrapping around you like a blanket. The doorway's low frame feels like a shield, a small victory against the storm outside. You're not just dodging a lintel, you're stepping into a home built to defy the elements, one stubborn stone at a time. Here's one more joke for you. What do you call a medieval doorway in a blizzard? A snow stopper. As you settle by the hearth, the wind rattling the door, you realize these doorways were more than just architecture. They were lifelines, tethering people to safety in a world where nature always had the upper hand. You're strolling through a medieval town square now, the air alive with the clink of coins and the shouts of hawkers peddling fish and flax. You pause before another low doorway, this one in a weaver's shop, its frame so short you're half convinced it's a prank. You've ducked through plenty of these by now, each one a puzzle of practicality, symbolism, or survival. But tonight, you're playing detective, sifting through the myths and misconceptions that swirl around why medieval doorways were so low. Were people really that short? Was it all about secret rituals? Time to separate fact from fireside gossip and find out what's really going on. Picture yourself as a curious traveler, your ears pricked for the tall tales locals spin over mugs of ale. The mainstream fact here is that many popular explanations for low doorways are either oversimplified or flat-out wrong. One of the biggest myths: that medieval people were so tiny they didn't need taller doors. Sure, the average height was a bit shorter, men around 5'6", women closer to 5 foot, but not hobbit level. Skeletons from the period show plenty of folks were tall enough to curse these lintels just like you. Low doorways weren't about matching human size. They were about resources, defense, and climate, as you've seen. The idea that everyone was a foot shorter is a lazy stereotype, like assuming they all had terrible teeth and bathed once a year. You duck into the weaver's shop now, the hum of a loom filling the air, the scent of wool and dye sharp in your nose. Another myth you've heard is that low doorways were some grand conspiracy to keep out evil spirits. Sure, you've come across quirky beliefs, like those Breton villagers who thought witches hated stooping, but there's no solid evidence this was a universal design goal. Most builders were too busy worrying about keeping the roof up to care about metaphysical intruders. It's a romantic idea, but it's like saying every castle moat was dug to trap dragons. Fun story, not much truth. Let's toss in a quirky tidbit. One odd myth from rural Germany claimed low doorways were built to make tax collectors trip, slowing them down so you could hide your best silver. It's probably just a tavern yarn, but you can imagine a villager chuckling as the local official stumbled, cursing the lintel. Historians still argue whether these stories were pure fiction or rooted in real resentment toward taxmen, but they're a reminder that medieval folks loved a good tale, especially if it made authority look foolish. You're probably thinking about other misconceptions now, like the idea that low doorways were only for castles to fend off invaders. You've seen how they were common in homes, shops, even churches, driven by budget and weather as much as defense. Or maybe you've heard that doorways were low because medieval builders were just bad at their jobs. Not quite. Those wonky frames and uneven stones were the best they could do with blunt tools and scavenged materials. Calling them incompetent is like judging a chef for cooking with a dull knife and no spices. They made it work, and those doorways stood for centuries, so maybe they deserve a little credit. Here's a joke to keep the mood light. Why did the medieval myth about doorways spread so fast? because it was too short to trip over. Seriously, though, you're starting to see how these misconceptions take root. People love simple answers, but the truth is messier. Low doorways were a mix of practical choices, saving wood, trapping heat, slowing thieves, and cultural quirks, not some grand mystical plan. The spirit-warding idea, for example, might have been a local superstition, but its unlikely builders across Europe were all chanting the same anti-ghost mantra. Another myth worth debunking is that low doorways were a status symbol, like the lower you built, the holier or humbler you looked. You've seen how humility played a role in church doorways, but for most homes, it was more about cost than piety. A peasant wasn't stooping to show off his virtue. He was stooping because that's all the timber he could afford. Wealthier folks sometimes had taller doors in private spaces, but even they kept public entrances low to blend in or save coin. The status angle is a half-truth, exaggerated by later romantics who saw the Middle Ages as a fairy tale of noble sacrifice. Let's add another quirky angle. Some modern tour guides claim low doorways were built to make medieval homes cozy. Cozy. Try claustrophobic. Those tiny entrances kept heat in, sure, but they also made every trip to the market feel like an obstacle course. The cozy myth comes from our rose-tinted view of the past, ignoring the reality of bruised foreheads and aching backs. Historians still argue whether this idea stems from Victorian nostalgia or just lazy storytelling, but it's a good example of how we rewrite history to fit our vibe. You're starting to feel like a myth buster now, aren't you? Every low doorway is a chance to question the stories we tell ourselves about the past. You duck through the weaver's doorway again, careful not to clip your head, and step back into the bustling square. The lintel's rough edge feels like a challenge, daring you to look closer, to dig beyond the easy answers. You're not just dodging a bruise, you're unraveling a web of half-truths, piecing together a clearer picture of a world that was practical, messy, and anything but simple. Here's one more joke for you. What do you call a medieval doorway myth? A lintel lie. As you wander through the market, the weaver's shop fading behind you, you realize these doorways weren't just architecture. They were storytellers, carrying truths and tall tales across centuries, waiting for someone like you to sort them out. You're wandering through a medieval city now, the streets narrow and twisting, the air thick with the scent of charcoal and fresh-cut hay. You pause before another low doorway, this one in a baker's shop, its lintel worn smooth by centuries of hands brushing past. You've ducked through so many of these by now, each one a snapshot of practicality, culture, or survival, but tonight, you're tracing a bigger arc. How these doorways evolved over time as medieval society shifted from huddled villages to bustling towns, from survival mode to something a little more ambitious. The world changed, and the doorways, stubborn as they were, started to change too. Picture yourself as a time traveler, hopping through the centuries, watching builders wrestle with wood and stone as their world transforms. The mainstream fact here is that doorway designs in medieval Europe evolved alongside social, economic, and technological changes, gradually growing taller and more elaborate by the late Middle Ages. Early medieval homes, built in the 9th or 10th centuries, had doorways so low you'd think they were designed for goats, driven by scarcity and the need to hunker down against raids or storms. By the 14th and 15th centuries, as trade boomed and towns swelled, doorways in wealthier homes and public buildings started to stretch upward, reflecting new priorities like status and comfort, though many stayed stubbornly short for practical reasons. You're ducking into the baker's shop now, the warmth of the oven wrapping around you, the scent of rye bread almost enough to make you forget the lintel you nearly clipped. In the early medieval period, doorways were often bare bones, 4 feet high, framed with whatever timber you could scavenge. Think of those Anglo-Saxon huts, where the doorway was less an entrance and more a hole you crawled through to escape the rain. Fast forward to the 13th century, and you're seeing stone arches in urban houses, still low but with a bit more flair, like the baker's shop you're in now. Wealth from wool or wine meant builders could afford better materials, and masons were learning tricks from cathedral projects, like how to distribute weight so a taller doorway wouldn't bring the wall down. Let's toss in a quirky tidbit. In some growing towns, doorways were retrofitted to be taller as families gained wealth, but the job was often botched, leaving wonky frames that confused everyone. There's a story from a Flemish town where a merchant widened his doorway to impress his in-laws, only for the lintel to sag and trap him inside for a day. Talk about a bad first impression. Historians still argue whether these renovations were common or just a sign of nouveau riche clumsiness, but they show a world in flux, where even doorways were caught between old habits and new dreams. You're picturing the timeline now, aren't you? The 11th century was all about survival. Low doorways in wattle and daub huts, built fast to keep out wolves or Vikings. By the 12th century, castles and manor houses started experimenting with slightly taller entrances for ceremonial spaces, though side doors stayed low for defense. Come the 14th century, urban growth and trade guilds brought fancier architecture. In places like Florence or Bruges, merchants built houses with doorways that crept up to 5 or even 6 feet, especially in public-facing rooms, to signal prosperity. But in rural areas, the old ways lingered. Peasants were still ducking through 4-foot holes well into the 15th century, because why fix what ain't broke? Here's a joke to keep things light. Why did the medieval doorway finally grow taller? It got tired of all the complaints. Seriously, though, you're seeing how these changes weren't just about aesthetics. Technology played a role too. By the late Middle Ages, better tools, like finer saws and stronger chisels, made it easier to craft longer lintels. Improved masonry techniques, borrowed from Gothic cathedrals, let builders risk taller arches without the whole house collapsing. And as forests were managed more efficiently, timber wasn't always as scarce, at least in wealthier regions. The evolution wasn't universal, though. In remote areas, like the Scottish Highlands or rural Poland, low doorways stayed the norm, tied to tradition and necessity. Even in cities, poorer neighborhoods kept their squat entrances, while the rich flaunted taller ones. It was like a class divide carved in wood and stone. Your doorway's height said as much about your status as your cloak or your horse. And yet, even the fanciest new doorways often kept a nod to the past, like a carved cross or a low side entrance, as if to say, we're moving up, but we're not forgetting where we came from. Let's add another quirky angle. Some late medieval doorways were built with stepped thresholds, where you had to lift your foot and duck at the same time, a holdover from earlier designs meant to keep out floods or livestock. In one English town, a chronicler complained that these thresholds tripped so many drunks it was practically a public service. Historians still argue whether stepped doorways were practical or just a nostalgic quirk, but they're a fun reminder that change was slow, and old habits died hard. You're starting to feel the pulse of this evolution, aren't you? Every low doorway was a link in a chain, stretching from the Dark Ages to the dawn of the Renaissance. You duck through the baker's shop again, careful not to bump your head, and step back into the bustling street. The lintel's smooth edge feels like a bridge between eras, carrying the weight of a world that was learning, growing, and occasionally tripping over its own ambition. Here's one more joke for you. What do you call a medieval doorway that's trying to evolve? A lintel in transition. As you weave through the city, the hum of progress in the air, you realize these doorways weren't just static. They were storytellers, tracing the slow, stubborn march of a society reaching for something new. You're standing in a modern village now, the kind that's half frozen in time, with cobblestone streets and tourist signs pointing to a preserved medieval cottage. The low doorway before you is a tourist trap stream, its lintel barely grazing your chest, and you can almost hear the guide spiel about quaint old times. You've ducked through centuries of these entrances by now, each one a puzzle of practicality, culture, and survival, but tonight, you're bridging the gap to today. You're exploring how medieval doorways, with all their stubborn lowness, connect to the architectural quirks and constraints we still wrestle with in the modern world, where function and form are still locked in an awkward dance. Picture yourself as a 21st century architect, scrolling through building codes on your tablet, yet haunted by the same questions those medieval carpenters faced. How do you balance cost, safety, and style? The mainstream fact here is that medieval low doorways share a surprising kinship with modern architectural compromises, where practical needs, like energy efficiency, budget limits, or safety regulations, often dictate design in ways that echo the past. Just as a medieval builder shaved inches off a lintel to save timber, today's architects might shrink a window or simplify a roofline to cut costs or meet green standards. The low doorway is a reminder that architecture, then and now, is about making tough choices in a world of limited resources. You duck through the cottage doorway now, the stone cool under your fingers, and step into a room that feels like a time capsule. Low ceiling, smoky hearth, the works. Back then, a low doorway saved wood, trapped heat, and kept out bandits, as you've seen. Today, you're not dodging lintels, but you're navigating similar trade-offs. Think about modern tiny houses, where every inch is optimized for space and efficiency. Their doorways aren't medieval low, but they're often compact, designed to maximize insulation or fit a minimalist footprint. In cold climates, like parts of Canada or Scandinavia, modern homes still use smaller entrances or vestibules to block drafts, a direct descendant of that medieval trick to keep the winter out. Let's toss in a quirky tidbit. Some eco-friendly homes today use Hobbit-style doors, rounded, compact entrances inspired by medieval designs, to boost insulation and charm. There's a community in Wales where builders market these as heritage chic, claiming they channel the spirit of medieval efficiency. Historians still argue whether this is a genuine nod to the past or just clever branding, but it's a fun echo of those old lintels, repurposed for Instagram-worthy sustainability. You're probably seeing the parallels now. Medieval builders worked with scarce timber and blunt tools. Modern architects deal with zoning laws, carbon footprints, and clients who want a mansion on a shed's budget. Take energy efficiency. Today's homes are designed to trap heat, just like those medieval cottages with their squat doorways. Double-glazed windows, sealed doors, even smart thermostats are all chasing the same goal: keep the warmth in, the cold out. And in earthquake-prone areas, like Japan or California, low doorways in traditional buildings mirror medieval logic. Smaller openings make for stronger walls, less likely to crumble when the ground shakes. Here's a joke to keep things light. Why do modern architects love medieval doorways? Because they're the original tiny home hack. Seriously, though, you're starting to see how these old designs resonate. Even safety echoes the past. Medieval low doorways slowed intruders. Today's building codes mandate fire-resistant doors or narrow exits in some public spaces to control crowds and prevent stampedes. It's not about bandits anymore, but the principle, using design to manage risk, feels like a callback to those cautious castle builders. The comparison isn't just about function. Aesthetics play a role too. Medieval doorways, with their rough-hewn charm, are mirrored in today's love for rustic or industrial design. Think exposed beams or reclaimed wood. You've probably scrolled through Pinterest boards where a low, arched doorway in a trendy cafe is captioned "Medieval Vibes." It's not just nostalgia, it's a nod to a time when form followed necessity, a lesson modern architects still grapple with when clients demand beauty on a budget. Let's add another quirky angle. In some modern off-grid communities, builders deliberately mimic medieval low doorways to force mindfulness, claiming it makes you present every time you enter a space. There's a commune in Oregon where residents swear it's calming, though the local chiropractor might disagree. Historians still argue whether this is a legitimate throwback or just hippie nonsense, but it's a reminder that the past still shapes how we think about our spaces. You're feeling the connection now, aren't you? Every low doorway, whether in a 12th century hut or a trendy eco-cabin, is a compromise, a balance of what you want versus what you can pull off. You duck through the cottage again, careful not to graze the lintel, and step back into the modern village, where cars hum past and a coffee shop's neon sign blinks nearby. The doorway's rough stone feels like a bridge across time, linking you to builders who, like today's designers, were just trying to make it work. Here's one more joke for you. What do you call a modern doorway inspired by medieval ones? A retro stoop. As you straighten up, the village bustling around you, you realize these doorways aren't just relics. They're lessons, whispering that the challenges of building a home, then and now, are all about finding balance in a world that never makes it easy. You're standing at the edge of a quiet medieval village now, the twilight casting long shadows across the thatched roofs, the air soft with a scent of damp earth and fading wood smoke. Before you is one last low doorway, this one in a weathered stone chapel, its lintel carved with faint crosses, worn smooth by centuries of pilgrims' hands. You've ducked through so many of these by now, each one a story of survival, ingenuity, and a world long gone. Tonight, you're pausing to reflect on the legacy of these low doorways, how they still shape our view of the past, whispering lessons across time as you stoop one final time. Picture yourself as a traveler, not just through this village but through the centuries, carrying the weight of all those lintels you've navigated. The mainstream fact here is that low doorways remain a defining feature of medieval architecture, preserved in castles, cottages, and churches, shaping how we imagine the Middle Ages. They're not just quirks of construction, they're icons, etched into our collective memory through fairy tales, films, and tourist trails. From the hobbit-like homes of fantasy to the preserved ruins of Europe, these doorways are a tangible link to a world where every choice, every inch of wood or stone, carried meaning. You duck through the chapel's doorway now, the cool air inside wrapping around you, the faint echo of hymns lingering in the shadows. These low entrances are more than relics, they're storytellers. They tell of a time when people built with what they had, when a 4-foot doorway was a shield against cold, thieves, or pride. They're why we picture medieval life as gritty, humble, and a little absurd, because who wouldn't chuckle at a knight banging his helmet on a lintel? Historical sites like England's Stokesay Castle or France's Mont Saint-Michel keep these doorways intact, drawing visitors who duck and laugh, feeling the past come alive under their fingertips. Let's toss in a quirky tidbit. Some modern festivals, like medieval reenactments, build replica villages with low doorways to give visitors a taste of the era's inconvenience. There's a tale from a German fair where a reenactor dressed as a noble got stuck in a doorway, his fake armor clanking as the crowd roared. Historians still argue whether these replicas exaggerate the lowness for dramatic effect or stay true to the past, but they're a reminder that these doorways aren't just history, they're performance art, pulling us into a world we can almost touch. You're probably seeing it now, how these doorways linger in our imagination. They're in every fantasy novel where a hero stoops into a tavern, in every movie where a castle's entrance feels like a trap. They shape how we think of the Middle Ages, not as a time of grandeur, but of grit, where even entering a room was a small battle. And they're not just in stories. Modern architects, as you've seen, borrow their logic for eco-homes or minimalist designs, proving that the medieval knack for doing more with less still resonates. Every time you duck through a low doorway in a historic site, you're not just avoiding a bruise, you're stepping into a mindset that valued resilience over comfort. Here's a joke to keep things light. Why do medieval doorways never go out of style? Because they keep history grounded, literally. But seriously, their legacy isn't just in the stones or the stories. It's in how they make us feel, connected to people who, like us, were just trying to make it through the day. You can almost hear their grumbles, their laughter, as they ducked through these same frames, cursing the lintel but loving the home it guarded. Let's add one more quirky angle. Some medieval doorways are now tourist photo ops, with signs warning, "Mind your head," in multiple languages. In one Irish castle, they sell bumper stickers that say, "I survived the low doorway." It's cheesy, but it shows how these entrances have become symbols of endurance, both then and now. Historians still argue whether their fame is due to their oddity or their universality, but either way, they're a bridge to the past, inviting us to stoop and wonder. As you linger in the chapel, the world outside fading to a hush, you feel the weight of this legacy settle around you. These doorways, so small and stubborn, are more than architecture. They're time machines, carrying the echoes of 1,000 lives. You trace the carved crosses on the lintel, your fingers brushing history, and realize they're not just relics. They're invitations to remember, to imagine, to duck and keep going, just as those medieval folks did. Wind down. The chapel grows quieter now, the flicker of candlelight softening the stone walls, the air heavy with the scent of ancient wood and wax. You're ready to leave, but the low doorway lingers in your mind, a final whisper from a world that built small but dreamed big. Each time you ducked, you carried their story, a tale of scarcity, survival, and stubborn hope. Let the day's worries slip away, like shadows fading in the dusk. You're safe here, wrapped in the calm of centuries, the low lintel a gentle reminder to rest, to breathe, to let the past cradle you. As you drift toward sleep, picture that doorway, small but strong, standing through storms and time, guiding you into a world where every entrance was a triumph. Close your eyes, let the hum of the night take over, and slip into dreams where history waits, just beyond the threshold. Sweet dreams.